teacher, and he was also really a visionary as a historian, because it was his vision of creating a center, the Center for the Study of War and Society, that would go beyond the military history only of generals or of troop movements, and instead would try to look at the experience of war and conflict in a broader social context. And when Charles Johnson established the center back in 1985, this was a new way of thinking about military history. Now, there are other centers with similar names through many universities in the United States and indeed worldwide. But Charles Johnson had this vision. He was the very first that we know of who articulated it. So we're proud of commemorating our founder, the founder of the center, with this lecture. There are a few people I'd like to also recognize before we plunge into our event for today and introduce our main speaker. The first person that I'd like to recognize especially is Mrs. Fay Bailey, who's sitting in the front row. Mrs. Bailey is the wife of Hop Bailey, who was an American hero. He was a World War II troop carrier pilot who flew on D-Day and many other missions, and we were delighted at the center to have him as one of our supporters. Now that he's no longer with us, we're delighted that Mrs. Bailey has established a new endowment in order to support the center in his memory, and we're tremendously grateful on that score. I'd also like to recognize another person who has witnessed history in very real ways, and that is Mr. Durward Swanson, who is sitting here in the first row, who is a Pearl Harbor survivor, and indeed was due to receive flying lessons from the person we'll be hearing about today in our lecture. He is originally from Georgia, now lives in Maryville, and just 2 weeks ago participated in our center's Veterans Oral History Project. Before asking you to recognize Mr. Swanson, I'd also like to ask all other veterans of American service to please stand up and be recognized as well. So if all veterans could please stand. Thank you so much for your service. We and your country at large are indebted to you most deeply. It's now my great pleasure to be able to introduce you to our speaker today, Mr. Rob Simbeck. He is a Nashville-based writer who has written a number of biographies, and his journalism has also appeared in the Washington Post, Country Weekly, Field and Stream, Guideposts, and many other magazines and newspapers. His work for the Nashville Scene has already won 3 national awards, and his column for South Carolina Wildlife has won 2 international awards. He is Nashville Bureau Chief of Bob Kingsley's Country Top 40, heard weekly on more than 320 stations. His books include Daughter of the Air, Tennessee's State Symbols, and American Music Legends. And I should mention fortuitously that we have copies of 2 of those volumes available for purchase and for signature for an autograph at the end of today's session at the back of our room. Mr. Simbeck has spoken at writers' conferences and universities across the country and is also a widely published poet. We're delighted to have him here today speaking on a topic which is extremely topical because March happens to be, as many of you will know, Women's History Month. And it doesn't get much more historical than the topic that he'll be addressing us on today. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Mr. Rob Simbeck.
Hello, everybody. Please pardon me sitting. I've got a bad back, and I can do anything but stand for long periods of time. I am very aware of the caliber of people and of topics that have come before me here for this lecture, and I feel very honored to be here, and I really hope I can bring something that rises to the level that Mr. Johnson would have wanted. I'll be telling a little bit of the story of a fairly neglected piece of American history, and even people who are World War II buffs often know very little about the WAFs, who were the first group of women who flew for the U.S. military. More know about the WASP, which were 1,100 women who followed them. But these were the first 28 who had to prove to a disbelieving army and disbelieving pilots that women could indeed ferry planes for the U.S. military. And I'll be telling it through the eyes of Nashville's Cornelia Fort. And I want to, when I hear people speak, I like the behind-the-scenes stuff too. So I'm going to tell you a couple of reasons why I'm actually here. Back when, let's see, 1993, a great writer named David Halberstam, who passed away a couple of years ago, wrote a piece for Vanity Fair magazine about Harrison Ford. And one of the things that he talked about was Harrison going through these Hamlet-level worries about getting his kids to jump the line. Somebody offered them to jump the line at Disneyland. And he went through all this stuff. And between that and the way Halberstam wrote about it, I couldn't stand it, so I wrote a letter to Vanity Fair. They published it. And I thought, well, that's the end of that. But 6 months later, I got a phone call. The woman said, "My name is Chloe Fort. If I wrote letters to the editor, that's the letter I would have written about that magazine, about that article." And then she said, "My aunt deserves a movie. Can we go to lunch?" And I thought, well, if you've got the guts to ask, I've got the guts to go. And she took me to the Bellmead Country Club, which is one of the places for high society in Nashville. I must confess, I had not been there before that day. And she told me about her Aunt Cornelia and how she had been in the air at Pearl Harbor giving a flying lesson the day the Japanese attacked, how she'd become part of the first group of women ever to fly for the U.S. military, and how she was the first female pilot ever killed in active duty. And we talked, had lunch, and toward the end of it I said, well, it's a great story and someone needs to do that, that's for sure. But I know what it is to write a book, and I don't think that I'm willing to, ready to commit to this right now, but thank you. And she said, before you polish off that no, I brought copies of the letters Cornelia wrote home to her family during World War II. And I just want you to take them home and read them and then call me and say no. Okay? And I took them home, and I was 3 letters in, and I fell in love with Cornelia Fort. I wish, as a 60-year-old, that I could write as well as she could at 23. And one of the things that I think makes this book worthwhile is that I use a whole lot of her letters and diary entries in it. But I very literally fell in love with her. She was a great patriot. She was a great spirit, a great soul. And to finish off that story, the way this book happened, and I recommend this book to writers, this way of getting book deals to any of you who write. The way I did it is probably the best way to do it. I wrote a piece for the Nashville Scene, our free weekly, about Cornelia. It was on the cover of an issue in '96, I think. And I was going to take that piece to New York, get a vacation, week or two here or there, try to knock on doors, convince an agent or publisher to do something with this story. The Scene came out on a Thursday. Friday afternoon, I got a phone call. The man said, "My name is Morgan Entrigan. I'm the president of Grove Atlantic in New York. I happen to be in Nashville delivering a commencement address. I grew up here. I'm staying at my mother's house. She brought home a copy of The Scene from Kroger. Would you like a book deal?" I said, "Twist my arm." He said, "I can only offer you $25,000 up front." And I was a much more struggling writer at that time, and I said, "Consider my arm twisted." So I met him the next day, and he was one of the people who helped inspire Bright Lights, Big City. And when I went to see him the next afternoon at 2 p.m. at his mother's place, he was still in his robe. So anyway, that's the background. And now to start with Cornelia. Cornelia Fort hit the birth lottery. Her father, when he got out of Vanderbilt Medical School, almost immediately earned positions as the head medical person for the state's prisons. He started his own hospital called the Fort Infirmary, and probably more to the point about their status in life, he and 4 businessman friends bought on the courthouse steps in want to say about 1905, a bankrupt insurance company. And it was called the National Life and Accident Insurance Company. And within a few years, it was bringing in millions of dollars. In fact, by 1925, they thought a great promotional arm would be this new radio thing that's happening. And so they founded WSM, whose call letters, WSM, stood for the company's motto, "We Shield Millions." And they also made millions. And so here, and I hope I can do this correctly, that was the house that that little courthouse purchase helped buy. It was, if you know Nashville, Shelby Park sits along the river just going east in town. The next 2 miles of riverfront was the Fort property, Fortland, they called it, both the mansion and the property itself. It was 365 acres, 2 miles of riverfront. For a while there was a public beach there until someone drowned. Dr. Fort raised world-class Jersey cattle, and there were servants. There was a cook who did not speak English. There was a gentleman named Epperson Bond, an African-American who had worked at a bank and some other places and used to tutor Cornelia in Latin as he drove her back and forth to school. He acted as chauffeur as well and sort of oversaw the estate. Her father, Rufus Fort, was an autocrat. He ran the household, so it wasn't military, but it was pretty close. The boys, and Cornelia had 3 older brothers, stood in line with the help every day to get their chores in the summer when they were off school. They always had those kind of chores. Cornelia was a tomboy from the beginning with 3 older brothers, as you might expect. They rode horses, she rode horses. They climbed trees, she climbed trees. And she turned out to be a pretty fearless little girl. That's her. I mean, that just speaks volumes about Cornelia. She, Daddy bring the pony over to take my picture. I'm going to stand on it. And she had great hair, too, which doesn't really show very well here, but what she did. And so this one goes. That is her at about the same age with her brothers and her father. And you can tell by looking at him that he did not brook nonsense. He was just somebody who, he ran the thing. And so Cornelia, there is a seminal event in the family history that happened when she was probably not much younger than that. Those cattle that Dr. Fort raised and sold all over the world, he took to the Tennessee State Fair every year. And in 1924, when Cornelia was 5, and her brothers were probably about 8, 10, and 12, he was showing them at the fair. Epperson took them to see all the fun things to do. One of the pieces of entertainment that year was a Chattanooga barnstormer named Jersey Ringel and his Flying Circus. It consisted of 2 airplanes, and Jersey, who was a wing walker, he would go from one to the other. They would sort of, pretend dive bomb the stands, thrilled and scared the people. The kids loved it, absolutely loved it. Dr. Fort, who usually found something disagreeable about that kind of adventure, had been the head of the draft board during World War I. He sent young men off to the military. As a doctor, he saw them when they came back. He knew that if they came back from the front lines, from the army, there was a chance they would just be shot up and could be patched back together again. He also knew that those who flew airplanes, if anything went wrong, did not come back to be patched up. They came back to be buried.